I am an interdisciplinary artist, but my background is in theater. So I was trained as a director, and after having done a few years of theater, I started to make way into other kinds of dramas of making art. So started to do performance photography, and then from there started to create installations. Um, and I think one theme that has sort of run across all the different kinds of works that I have made is this kind of interface between body and technology. Um, and I've been quite interested in the politics of technology and how that changes um, our perception, our comprehension of what the body is. Um, and I think it is with this curiosity that I keep seeking newer and newer kinds of grammars and newer kinds of ways of working and developing body-based practices. All my work is body-based, and and I think this sort of each work brings a new question for me. For today's talk, I thought what I would do is to talk about directing in the age of cyber culture, because I think that theater direction, as we have understood and as we have been trained in, I went to a drama school like many of us, and we were not prepared for the kind of times we're living in right now. So how does one continue to make theater as a director in the times that we're living in, where the conventional modes of gathering together, having access to a studio space or a theater, and of inviting people in physical proximity to make work and then also to show work, is no longer a given for theater makers. We have had to adapt. I have had to adapt. I have had to think of new ways to make performances. And I know many of my friends and colleagues across the world have been dealing with this question at least for the last year or so. And this led me to ask myself if I can still create. And how does one create performance-based work which is not just a which is not just work that is transported from the physical space to online spaces? Um, is there a way to actually think about the online space, the digital culture, as the very foundation over which then these performance-based works can be made? And that is something that I have been asking through my practice for the last few years. My first work that I made was in 2009, which was entirely made for the internet. And it's taken me sort of 10, 11 years to come to the work that I will be presenting today. What I will also do for today's talk is to divide the talk into, say, 40 minutes of my own presentation, and then the remaining 20 minutes in which I would be very happy to take questions from our attendees. So please do feel free to type your questions in the Q&A box or the chat box, and I will be very happy to take them after I end my talk. I'm going to share my screen, and hopefully this works. Sometimes it doesn't. Benedict, can you give me a thumbs up if you see my presentation? Right. Okay. Good. So directing in the age of cyber culture, performing with our bodies, performing with code. Code, as we know today, is also a performative agent. It is mediating a lot of subjectivities across the internet, subjectivities of different, not just different kinds of cultures and countries and geographies, but also also futures. Also, it's also sort of in conversation with and trying to influence the way we behave, um, and also shape the interrelational conditions that we find ourselves in today. So for me, um, in my work, I think a lot about how does one perform with code as a co-performer, as an agent of performativity, as well as the bodies that are present. What are the kind of interfaces that are possible between these two? Um, and the work that I made last year, after this was sort of 6, 7 months of active work on this project. This work was titled "The Last Poet," and this work premiered in December 2020 in an online performance festival that was held in India. This last poet um, is a theater of love, a city of sorrow, and a people searching for their missing poet. The last poet attempts to capture a political moment. A poet disappears, a virus spreads within and amongst us, and our world becomes haunted. The audience is invited to immerse themselves in the constancy of this virtual event. A whirling city searching for its missing poet, listless yet hungry, moving yet remaining still. In it, there are multi-loads, and there are multiple possibilities in how you can experience this show. This show was triggered by disappearances that I was reading about and also experiencing living in India last year. When the pandemic hit India, it was not just a biological virus that um, enraptured India. It was also um, an authoritarian regime that got the opportunity to launch state violence against artists and activists. Um, and one of the conditions that was in effect last year in a country like India was that public assembly was banned. And so, in one of the in the largest democracy of the world, it was impossible to stage protests and to stage dissent by coming together physically on the streets. And this gave an opportunity to the state to unleash a very, very brutal um, violence against artists and activists who are anti-establishment, whose work stands for dissent and protest and critique of the ruling regime. News after news and articles after articles started coming in, and in addition to the pandemic, this actually became a very disturbing uh, period for many of us. And so when I was thinking about this work, I think this was something that I was thinking about a lot, about a poet that goes missing and no one knows about what has happened to that poet. And this is a people's poet, a poet who actually um, wrote for his community, and suddenly goes missing one day. This poet has been facing a lot of threats, social threats, threats online, and this is also um, not very far from the reality that we have been living in India for several years, where poets, especially poets, the artist of the written word, has been threatened. So the last poet sort of was born out of this impetus, uh, and this was, like I say, it was a political moment for me, not just a social moment. The show premiered online in the Serendipity Arts Festival in December 2020, and I thought a lot about what to call this genre, and I was while I was thinking about it, the idea of cyber theater came to mind, where this interdisciplinary aspect of looking at live performance, creative coding, film and sonic art created this immersive event, which was interactive with digital scenography being the very venue into which audiences were invited. And then there was a sort of a dramaturgy, a very unique kind of dramaturgy that unfolded for each audience member who logged in online. So it was multi-layered, this project. I invited programmers and coders to work with people who make films and sound art. And there were, at the core of it, were 5 performers who were performing live through the show. One of the things that sort of was the running thread was this feeling of anonymity and estrangement. Um, we had already spent about 10 months in lockdown. There was a feeling of isolation in the, amongst us, and there was also this feeling of sort of being abandoned and not being able to reach out to the community or to other artists, and this sort of all of these sort of experiences started to play into making this work. So you could book tickets online, and this was the publicity poster. Now, as I started work on this project, I was thinking about, how does one think about the internet as a space for performance? And one of the uh, paragraphs I remembered from a book that I had read way back was this book called Trickster City, um, Writings from the Belly of the Metropolis. This is edited by an Indian writer called Shweta Sharda. And there's this paragraph in that book. And this goes like this. Finally, Shamsher offered his explanation. A place is Nishastaga, is a place where the gaze has not been fixed and time has not yet been disciplined, where nobody has yet been described as a vagabond. When a space loses its Nishastaga, it condenses into a jaga, jaga meaning place. By then, it has moved through its processes of working out what it wants to remember and what it wants to forget, who it wants to keep in and who to keep out, which ways of being it finds acceptable, and which other ways it shuns or tries to stay away from. And this sort of conceptual understanding of how does something go from space to place is what started to guide the design of this digital scenography. And I started to work with programmers and coders, and we called it poetic instancing and generative collaborations. How does one start to create generative worlds for this project? On the left, this sort of peach, saffron, orange kind of building that you see is the very apartments that I live in. So I photographed these apartments, and this architecture sort of became the draft over which we started to design this online world. And the coder started to use P5, which is a very popular, very commonly used generative coding program. And as they started to code, on the right, you can see that this code starts to generate these 3D worlds into which you can immerse yourself. And we were working with inspiration from a lot of Indo-Islamic architecture that we are surrounded by in our cities. So there are these arches and tombs, and they are swirling. They're going around. And as you sort of log into this, everybody who logs in has a unique experience, so that this code generates this world on the audience's browser. There is no centralized place from where this world is being generated, so that everybody who logs in actually begins to navigate through the space, making the kind of choices they do in their own very unique way, and the code begins to generate new corners of this city around them. So this kind of poetic instancing and experimenting led to a generative world like this one. So you have these um, boxes like rooms and um, sort of these street elements, public domain elements like street lights and benches and cycles and electricity poles and all of these things that we are surrounded by in our cities are unhinged. They are no longer located on the ground. It's almost like you've entered a world in which there is gravity no longer exists and everything is just sort of swirling around. It's whirling and you're in the middle of this swirling and you have to sort of stay still to make sense of where you are. While this is, of course, a static screenshot, I hope everybody who's looking at it can imagine what this would look like if this whole city was very gently kind of going, swirling around, and you were in the middle of it, as it were, the eye of the storm, looking at this city. Now, every element in this generative city is clickable. So that as you hover your cursor on any one of these rooms or these elements, the cursor changes color, which tells you that you can click on it, on this object or on the space, and then you will be taken into these rooms. What happens when you go into these rooms? You actually meet live performers. You meet characters. The characters are sitting there waiting for you. And these are 5 performers, and they play through the span of the show, which is about 90 minutes. They play about 30 different characters. And every time you enter a room, you meet a new character. And that character sort of, it's a fictional world, and these characters are all people who are at some point of their lives were associated with the poet. So you meet family of the poet, you meet friends, you meet colleagues, you meet people who heard about the poet, you meet people who've been extremely inspired by his writing, and everybody is looking for him. Everybody, I mean, there are, it's almost like a rumor city. You hear a rumor every time you go into a room about what might have happened to the poet. Everybody is scared. Everybody, I mean, there is a sense of trepidation in each one of the characters, and everybody is also speculating what has happened to the poet, and as a consequence, what has happened to their city that they live in. So you go into these rooms and you meet these different characters. And on your screen, so you have other elements as well. This is a live performance, so all the performers are live, and but how do you know this is live? I mean, and slowly sort of you begin to understand that that this is really a sort of a live digital assembly that you are a part of as an audience member. On the left top, you of course have the title of the show. On the right top, you have about the show. You have full screen logo and also a volume button. On the right bottom, you have a chat box. So this is a chat box that actually is not a chat box that allows you to talk to other audience members, but to the makers of the show. And the makers of the show can also send you um, sort of broadcast messages to you in this chat box. And when you open, sometimes there are a couple of lines of poetry. Sometimes there are instructions. Sometimes there are sort of nudges and some kind of provocation for the audience to do something. What can they do? Every few minutes, the leave button, which is which appears left bottom, um, every few minutes this leave button appears, and it appears only for 1 minute. So you kind of see the color changing for a minute. If you press on this leave button, you exit the room and you are thrown back into the city. And then you navigate through those buildings and rooms and click on some other room, or you can choose to stay and not click on this leave button. And if you choose to stay, you are still witnessing the live performance of this of one of the actors. If you choose to leave, you go into other rooms and you meet other characters. And of course, everybody, because we were in lockdown, these are the homes of uh, all these actors. So it took us about 3 months to transform our domestic spaces into spaces in which fiction can be staged, um, and it can sort of become this show-ready kind of corner. Um, and so this is an interesting space. So one of the actors actually took the corner, uh, the bottom corner under his kitchen shelf, um, and then transformed, and he would crawl into this space, and he transformed that space into a performance space. And this was actually the process of, you know, culling out performance spaces from the living spaces of our team. You can be thrown back out, of course, if you choose to leave, come back into the city. You click again, you navigate, you go through the city, and you click again on the room. And then, of course, there is some rooms that you go into.
आहन में ढलती जाएगी 21वीं सदी फिर भी फसल सुनेगी.
Some rooms that you go into are not live rooms, but rooms in which you might encounter a film. This is one of the films that we created for the show. And the footage that you see in this film is actually very controversial footage. A lot of this footage is being taken off the internet because this footage has become quite an embarrassment for the ruling regime. There are several controversies surrounding this kind of footage. And every time it appears online, whether on YouTube or on other kind of social media platforms, it is very quickly taken down. The ruling establishment doesn't want this to be seen. And so this, so for us and for me, this project became a way to collect this footage and keep it safely ensconced within one of the rooms that you really have to find by navigating through the city. Some people, of course, found it. Other people did not find it. It depended on how you navigated across the city and what kind of choices you made. And then, of course, once these films ended, you could again come back out and go to other rooms where characters were waiting for you. Now, of course, because we're living in a country like India and our internet is not entirely reliable, and we also face power cuts quite regularly. What also happened was that sometimes actors would, just face a power cut and they would go offline. In which case, if you entered a room, you would see some kind of this kind of a VHS kind of glitch that appears, which would tell you that maybe this room is not live yet. And sometimes you would also, at the back end, what we were also doing was to switch the live stream to a recorded stream if time allowed for it, so that the audience could still watch parts of the performance which may not be live, but still would get the sense of the show. And once the actor came back on, um, uh, the internet came back on, we would then patch the stream into the city. And this was another sort of interactive element where I wanted the audience to make choices. Um, so every time a character would finish one scene or one character, they would begin to take their makeup off and their costumes off. And then they would present themselves as themselves. They would sit quietly and, as a gesture of solidarity, would gag themselves. So they would tie something around their mouths or cover their face and remain still till this choice appeared on the screen. Now, this is the choice where it's a live polling that is happening. So the audience needs to poll. Um, and there are these sort of four choices, which means that there are these four scenes, and depending on which scene gets the most number of votes, um, maybe the actor would play that scene. Now, sometimes, of course, the actor would play uh, the scene that would get the most votes to play, and sometimes they would exercise their own agency and go for another scene and reject the audience's votes. And this was something that we kind of kept free flowing, and we discussed it a lot about how to go about this, and every actor sort of came up with their own way to um, sort of, counterbalance what the audiences voted for and what they wanted to, how they wanted to proceed. And this polling sort of appeared in every live character room there was. Of course, if there was no polling and no audience member clicked on any one of the choices, the polling would appear again. So the actor would remain still till somebody who was watching acted upon and expressed their choice. And of course, sometimes you would go into. So this is just to remind everybody from how I began this. So this is just a cross section of the different kinds of characters and spaces and rooms that we had put together in this one graphic image. Um, and of course, when the show ended at 90 minutes. And wherever the audiences were, they would be thrown out of those rooms, um, and they would begin to sort of, recede from the city. The city would sort of leave their screens and go away, and they would be brought back to where they started from, right in the beginning. And this is the back end of the show. So the programmers that I worked with, they worked hard on developing a backstage. Now, when we physically work in the theaters, there is a backstage that are wings and green rooms, and so there is a lot of control that a show needs to exercise upon, for the sake of coordinating the different sort of acts and stuff. But how do you do it online? Zoom has a very rudimentary and a very unsatisfactory sort of backstage for us to control what happens next. And this digital city needed a more sophisticated way to exercise some degree of control over how the show goes. So this was a dashboard that was created, and on the left you see a list of everybody who has registered and bought tickets for the show, and then you also see start show. In the middle, the room status tells you about uh, how many actors are there online right now. So are they active or not? and how many people are watching each one of the actors. So you would have these sort of users there. And then on the right, these are chat threads. So chats that the backstage is having with uh, audiences. If they're facing any technical difficulties, they could text us. And sometimes there were these sort of, in some cases, there were these very poetic exchanges that also unfolded. And this was one way in which the backstage and the actors and the programmers and the coders, all of us were somehow kind of working together online. The team for this project came from all across India. We were in about 7 or 8 cities, quite far away from each other. We never physically met once, so all of this was actually developed online. And the show, of course, ended with um, one of my favorite quotes from a Lithuanian American poet and filmmaker, Jonas Makers, who says that in the very end, civilizations perish because they listen to their politicians and not to their poets. And this is the quote that I wanted the audiences to leave with. And so this became the last sort of frame of the show. So that's what the show was. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and bring myself back up here. This show is still happening. We premiered it last December, and there are more shows that we are going to do next month. And you know, the sort of the good thing about online spaces is that people can watch the show from around the world. So I hope that people who are listening to us today um, are also able to, you know, book tickets for this show and watch the show and give me feedback, share their thoughts with me after having watched it. So I will stop here and maybe invite questions from listeners, and if there are any comments, I'd be very happy to take them.
Hi, everyone. Just a reminder, there's a Q&A button on Zoom, and you're welcome to type into that to submit your question, and Amitesh will review those live. So thank you for your time.
So one of the things, of course, one of the challenges of this show is, of course, the language. About more than half the show is in Hindi and Urdu, which are one of the more popular and commonly spoken languages in North India. But of course, we are working on international versions of the show, and also looking at how some of the scenes can be translated into English for an international audience. This is really the first time that I created such a project. So there were many sort of questions and also many failures across along the way. Um, and also there were, the aspect of dramaturgy is something that I had to sort of discuss a lot with the dramaturg on the show, because how does one write for fictional theatrical work for this kind of a project where audiences are moving freely across this site, across this digital scenography, and are also sometimes leaving or sometimes staying to watch more of the scenes. So how do you, as a dramaturg, what is the kind of text you write, and how do you structure this text um, across this scenography, across this space, so that in a way in which as audiences make these choices, the the dramaturgical intent, the spirit, the research that has gone into creating this text is experienced by everybody, even if it's in a piecemeal manner. So there were extensive discussions that the dramaturg and I had over text. There were rounds and rounds of text that were drafted and thrown away, um, and we were sort of searching for a form that would make sense for this kind of a piece. Um, and finally, these sort of 30 different pieces of texts were written, which flowed into each other. So one piece carried resonances and echoes of other pieces, and so as the audiences sort of moved from one room and one space to another, they could hear names and references and relationships and in about incidents that they left in other rooms. um, and slowly sort of this image, this perception of the city emerged as you went from the first minute to the 90th minute. I mean, akin to, you know, how you sometimes walk, you go to a foreign city and you walk through that city for the first time, and kind of sometimes imagine as you're walking through apartment buildings, and you sometimes imagine what would be the life of these of people who live inside these houses, these rooms. And could you, you know, what would, if you could pick up on their lives for a few seconds or a few minutes, how what what image would it create for you of that city? And I think that sort of this um, this was the guiding uh, idea to develop this kind of a dramaturgy for this piece. Uh, there's a question in the Q&A box by Chetna. Um, is digitization mundane or confusing in performative construct world? How did the audience react or respond? Any post follow up with the audience? Yeah, that's an interesting question actually. This was actually one of the challenges of making this work, where because this world is very new, how will the audiences find their way into this world? There are many projects that are being made on Mozilla Hubs, for example. And if you've ever entered Mozilla Hubs, the first half hour is quite disorienting. Um, you have to use the keyboards differently if you're not a regular user of virtual gaming. And so how do you, so I think what happened was that we quickly realized that the audience actually needed a lot of hand holding for the first 10 minutes of the show. So there were clear instructions that appeared on the screen in the chat box. There were nudges to encourage the audiences to discover and explore by using a few navigational tools. Um, and I have to say that I think almost everybody, beyond the first sort of 5 or 10 minutes, almost everybody sort of got the hang of the world and how interactivity was programmed for this world. And we also sort of, when we designed this interactivity, we kept in mind very natural sort of responses of what would the audiences think or expect when they enter this world, and how does one build those interactive tools inside. How did the audiences react or respond? Well, there were many different kinds of responses. Um, some audiences stayed in some rooms for much longer than others. Some audiences uh, wanted to quickly go through all the rooms and discover as much of the city as possible and as quickly as possible. Uh, the one of the phrases that the programmer kept using was that there are two kinds of audiences. One is the grazers and the other is the racers. The grazers want to stay with would like to stay with one room and chew upon what the performance that is happening there, whereas the racers um, are going to speed through all the aspects of this digital world and quickly sort of need to sort of put the city together in some way and comprehend it. So I mean, we had all kinds of audiences for this work, and all kinds of messages and texts were being exchanged. Was there any post follow up with the audience? Well, I mean, the audiences could write to us on email, but after the show ended, the interactive scenography ended. So there was it was not no longer possible for audiences to interact with us on that platform itself. But they could always email us, and we did receive several messages over email. But thank you for that question. The second question is by Dhan Prakash, and what are the challenges an actor and director uh, challenges that actors and directors face in online cyber performance? Are the actors and directors able to explore their creative potential? Well, I mean, it's really it's a very new kind of platform, and I think it's the more work we are making as artists, the more we are exploring and pushing the envelope, as it were, of what online performance can mean. Um, the challenge, of course, for the actor is that they are no longer they can no longer see their audience, um, which many of the actors that I was rehearsing with kept sort of lamenting. They cannot see the audiences anymore, and so that sort of the usual um, transference of performative energy from actors to directors
You're back.
Hello, am I back? Right. Sorry,
Yes.
there was a power cut in my place, so I might have dropped for a couple of seconds. Um, so the challenge for the actor is quite, of course. I mean, because there's no live audience. I mean, the transference of energy doesn't work, and so everybody had to reorient their performance for a small little hole, camera hole atop their laptops, and some of them were using mobile phones as well. So the frame became the stage for everybody, and that's one primary shift that the performers had to make. For the director, of course, I mean, I had the feeling that I had to mobilize my uh, artistic understanding of not just the theater stage, but also of film and cinema and of the internet. So I had to hold these three sort of aesthetic mediums together, and think about frames and visuals and images, as well as think about the dramaturgy of coding and programming to hold this entire piece together. So it was quite a challenge. So sort of, I think all of us were working beyond what we already had known, and it was a very generative experience for us in terms of new knowledge that was being created. The other question: do you call this form of performance theater? Um, well, I would say cyber theater, not just theater. Um, Professor Helen, who is also, I think, speaking in a few days in this very seminar in 2000, in the year 2000, coined a word called cyberformance. And I think that is what she will also be talking about in her talk in a few days. And she would describe cyberformance as a kind of live performance that happens on the network and through the network. So the liveness is there, of course, but the liveness is now distributed across the network. So there is so what we have in theater, is the live co-presence, that we are co-present both in terms of time and space as witnesses of the performance that is taking place. I think the space has been disrupted by the internet, and so the space for us now is the internet itself. And so all of us today, like, we've gathered live in real time in different time zones, and but there is no physical space in which we've gathered. So I think this disruption is what has, for I think personally for me, has also become quite exciting to explore. What new forms of performance in theater are now possible um, in given this disruption. So I call my piece cyber theater, and many other artists title their, describe their uh, online performances in with different words. There is no consensus on what each one of these words means exactly. But I think we'll have to wait a few years and debate this out and let the discourse develop a little bit uh, to say very confidently, I think, what each of these terms means. The other question is, are the characters of different chambers exchange text or reactions with each other to create drama in The Last Poet? Um, no, the in this show, the characters were not in touch with each other. So what you saw as an audience member were actually multi-logue. So they were monologues, but they were sort of there was a multiplicity of these monologues as you went from one room to another. So that there was a so it was sort of what was interesting for me to discover was also this idea that there is a deception that takes place when we talk with each other online. So for example, right now I cannot see all the attendees. I can see none of you. I can see Benedict, and I can, and so there is a deception. um, there is sort of a play of presence and absence together. um, I need to believe that all of you who are listening to me right now are really there. um, and I can feel your presence through the questions that are put in. But that's the only evidence that I have, really. Otherwise, I just see Benedict. And so this talk can seem like a very intimate conversation between Benedict and me, because we are the only two people who are visible in a sense. But we know that there are many other people listening to this talk. And so there is this kind of a very uncanny co-presence of intimacy, a dialogue that is happening very intimately between two people. But at the same time, we know that this dialogue is being witnessed by several more. So, for example, in The Last Poet, uh, we had made space for 200 people to book and watch the show together. But the fact that there were 200 was never visible, never felt in the show. They were just numbers then, that we had backstage, and they were just numbers that the actors could see on their screens while they were performing. Um, so this sort of this quest this was a nagging question for us, that the audiences have been reduced to numbers, and what are the different ways in which agency can play a role beyond these statistic and numbers as well, uh, in this piece. So yes, I think that would be that was a question that I'm still, I think, searching for, and maybe this would also be inspiring for me to make the next piece. Another question is, of course, is Macbeth possible to perform in this genre of cyber theater? I guess, yeah, possible. I guess, I mean, right now the cyber uh, medium is open to all kinds of experiments. The Last Poet was one experiment, and I'm in this very seminar, in this very sort of online performance festival. There are all kinds of experiments that are being shown, and it'll be really exciting to see what is going to be shared in the next few days, and what are artists doing across the world with cyber performances. Um, the next question is, the digital theater can contribute such as enhancing access for those with sorry, disabilities and removing barriers to attendance beyond the boundaries of location, and thus reaching wider audience. What is your view on this? I absolutely agree, actually. Um, Having done a lot of performance in theater in physical proximity, I think making The Last Poet was very liberating, because the audiences could actually join from their living rooms, and from spaces across the world. And yes, I sort of did begin to think of cyber performances as a more democratic way of performing, where the access is open to everybody. It is not limited by physical proximity, and it is also not limited by um, modes of access that are not available, even if uh, you live close by, or even if you can, yeah, that you can come and attend. And I think digital theater does actually open a wide range of different kinds of accessibilities, which were not available before. And I would also imagine that sort of the future of digital theater and digital performance um, categorically responds to this idea of wider and more democratic access, um, and not limit itself to people who are only invested in the digital world, and sort of expands the horizon for all of us. Would you say, the next question, would you say the performance also reflects on the politics of the internet as a space and place? Yes, I am, as an artist, deeply invested in the politics of the internet, both as space and as place. And while making this piece both um, on the level of programming and coding and dramaturgy, um, I was working together. So all the rehearsals and meetings that happened, uh, the dramaturg and the the coders and the programmers were present. And as there was the next level of development that happened in code and programming, that affected the dramaturgy as well. And so there was this kind of a sort of a ping pong that was being played between these different disciplines that had not worked together before, um, to really try and focus on the politics of the internet itself, and the possibilities of alternative forms of interrelationalities that a space like internet can open up for us. So the dramaturgy, the performances, the poll, the choices that the audiences had to make, the restrictions that we put in place, the way everybody could navigate across this city, 90 minutes as the outer limit of the show. All of these questions of the show were actually debated very hotly in the development process, and for us, I think, were very important markers of how to develop this show. So thank you for this question. This is something that was also very close to my heart um, while making work for the internet. So if there are no longer any questions, we are almost out of time as well. Um, just about 2 minutes to go um, to the end of this lecture. Um, I hope all of you really enjoyed this, and thank you so much for these questions. Uh, absolutely fantastic questions, many of which I've noted them down, and I will keep thinking about them as we do more shows of this work. Um, if you want to know more about my work, my work is up on my website as well. So if you Google my name, there's an archive there with sort of photographs and videos and more information about my work. Thank you so much